Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis. This week's announcement is for the 60s, and it's week 3. We are continuing this week to read about the presidency of John F. Kennedy, and particularly the foreign policy of John F. Kennedy. If you haven't read the reading we had last week, please continue to read that, and I will leave that posted in the readings for this week. However, I'm going to scan a new reading, a chapter for you, on the Vietnam War, the origins of the Vietnam War, that I want you to take a look at. And it'll be in PDF form, and it'll go up the beginning of the week. I'll get it up there tomorrow, Monday, for you. And I want you to read that. This week we're talking about the origins of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War really, by the way, begins with the Eisenhower presidency. Arguably, you can say it really begins even before that. But in terms of having American advisors involved, it really begins during Eisenhower's presidency. But of the larger scale commitment truly began during John F. Kennedy's presidency, as the government of South Vietnam became increasingly embattled, and the Kennedy administration sent thousands of advisors to South Vietnam to help the government and to help the army of South Vietnam, which was our ally in South Vietnam, was their army, to help them fighting against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong guerrillas, particularly at that time the Viet Cong guerrillas that operated in South Vietnam at the time. This week also, of course, don't forget we have our discussion forum. Make sure that you post or reply. It doesn't matter. I want to see activity by Thursday. I want to see a total, unless otherwise noted, a total of 1 post, 2 replies, over 2 separate days, beginning by Thursday, at the latest. There's no test, no quiz, or anything this week. So going back to Vietnam, here's the factoid for this week, okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about Vietnam for you. The Vietnam War had its roots in French colonialism. And it was from French colonialism that, of course, we saw the revolutionaries like Ho Chi Minh rise up in Vietnam. After World War II, the Vietnamese declared their independence. But the French sought to recolonize Vietnam after World War II. And of course, it was in the context of the Cold War and the French struggle to recolonize that the United States began committing itself to what was happening in Vietnam. By 1949, China had fallen to communism. By 1950, the Korean War had broken out. And so as the Vietnam War became increasingly more intense, the United States increasingly footed the bill for the French who were fighting there, and the United States increasingly defined that conflict as a war to contain communism. By the late 50s and early 60s, the U.S. was trying to create a government in South Vietnam. They were trying to get a leader in South Vietnam that could be an American ally, that could create and garner some nationalist support in the South to counter the highly popular Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. And of course, eventually, this leads to the outbreak of the Vietnam War in the late 50s. The North Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh, had believed that the agreement ending the French Indochina War, and I'll get to the factoid in just a second, but they had believed that the treaty ending the French Indochina War in 1954, after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, one of the most famous battles of the 20th century, they insisted that that treaty, it did, called for elections to reunify the country. But when the United States realized that that election would result in all of Vietnam becoming communist in an election, the United States and its ally in the South balked at the election and ignored the election, and instead put all of its support between a South Vietnamese government led by an individual known as Ngo Dinh Diem. And Diem was a rather autocratic, oppressive leader. In a lot of ways, you might call him a dictator who ruled the country ultimately pretty forcefully. And this created tremendous controversy in Vietnam. And as the Vietnam War began to begin in South Vietnam, long before American ground troops were in Vietnam, the leader in South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, increasingly alienated his population by repressing people that he believed were associated with communist activity, by increasingly alienating the Buddhist population in Vietnam from his government. He was Catholic, a French-educated Catholic. So anyway, the United States, aside from those issues, really felt that Vietnam, South Vietnam, was the place to contain communism. That it had to happen in South Vietnam. If we didn't contain communism in South Vietnam, the fear was that communism would spread throughout the region. That first it was China, then you have the Korean War, and then if Vietnam fell, the belief was the so-called domino theory, that entire regions could fall to communism. And so the United States decided to draw the line in Vietnam. During the Kennedy presidency, the goal was to do that through the usage of advisors. These advisors would go and they would train and provide guidance, and they would work with the government and the military of South Vietnam to fight the Viet Cong guerrillas. It's from the advisors program that eventually, in 1965, you have the United States begin the insertion of full combat ground troops into Vietnam. And we'll get to that subsequently in the class. So here's the factoid. And remember, email me this factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight to get your bonus point on a test at the end of the term. The factoid is this. Advisors in Vietnam were not supposed to be involved in fighting. They were supposed to advise. They weren't supposed to be flying combat missions. They weren't supposed to be fighting in the field. But the reality was that these advisors were out providing guidance, providing battlefield insight to South Vietnamese military officers. And as a result of that, of course, American advisors were inevitably becoming involved in fighting. The advisors were not simply advising, they were becoming actually involved as combatants. Well, this created a dilemma for the Kennedy administration. It really created one of the more negative legacies of the Vietnam War, which was efforts by the presidency to keep the public sort of in the dark about its policies there. And so whether it was Kennedy or Johnson or Nixon, ultimately, the American people really had a sense that in a lot of respects, these administrations, all of them, went to great lengths to mislead the American people, if not lie to the American people. And that had tremendous political ramifications for how Americans ultimately thought about their government, not only in that period, but after that period. The Kennedy administration became particularly upset by the fact that investigative journalists like David Halberstam, Halberstam, David Halberstam, was an investigative journalist for the New York Times. The Kennedy administration became increasingly upset because journalists like Halberstam were beginning to report negatively on the situation in Vietnam. And they began to report that advisors were actually involved in the fighting, and these were potentially controversial revelations. And here's the factoid. Because of those revelations from investigative journalists, the Kennedy administration tried to get David Halberstam, the New York Times investigative journalist, they tried to get him reassigned and recalled because they believed his investigative reporting on Vietnam was problematic to the United States' efforts there. So John F. Kennedy's administration tries to get David Halberstam recalled from Vietnam by the New York Times. And here begins during Vietnam this sort of tense relationship between the press and the United States. And it begins the pattern between Kennedy, Johnson, and then Nixon of misleading the American public or trying to cover up the true nature of American policy in Vietnam. And in some cases, in some of those presidents, even lying to the American people. All right, everyone. Remember the reading. If you haven't done last week's reading, make sure you do it this week. The same reading we're talking about this week, Kennedy and the Vietnam policy, the origins of the Vietnam War. I will post that reading in Canvas for you no later than Monday or Tuesday this week to help you get started on that. I also have a little brief synopsis that I have done. Actually, a student of ours helped put this together. That is a nice short synopsis of the Vietnam War. I'll put that in for you as well. So check that out. It should be helpful. Let's have a great week. Discussion forum this week. That's it. Email me if you have any questions. Email me that factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight.